The relationship between Nazi Germany and Halloween reveals a fascinating contradiction between public ideology and private practice, between the regime's carefully cultivated image and the occult obsessions of some of its highest-ranking leaders. While the Nazi Party publicly condemned Halloween and many other traditional celebrations as degenerate foreign imports incompatible with proper German culture, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich, harbored deep fascinations with paganism, mysticism, and occult practices that led him to conduct secret ceremonies in his private domain that bore striking resemblances to the very traditions the regime officially rejected. The Nazi attitude toward holidays and celebrations was complex and often contradictory. When Hitler came to power in 1933, one of the regime's cultural projects was to reshape German society according to Nazi ideology. This meant eliminating or transforming traditions that didn't fit the Nazi worldview and creating new celebrations that reinforced party ideology and German nationalism. The Nazis were particularly hostile to anything they perceived as foreign, especially if it came from countries they viewed as racially inferior or ideologically opposed to National Socialism. Halloween, with its roots in Celtic traditions, and its modern form heavily influenced by Irish and American customs, was exactly the kind of celebration that Nazi ideologists found problematic. It was not traditionally German. It came from outside influences. It involved elements of superstition and folk belief that the Nazis, who promoted a supposedly scientific racism and modern industrial power, viewed as primitive and backward when practiced by non-Germans. Additionally, Halloween's association with death, the supernatural, and the macabre in a carnivalesque context of costumes and sweets didn't align with the Nazi preference for solemn, martial celebrations that emphasized German strength and racial destiny. The characterization of Halloween as degenerate fit within the broader Nazi campaign against what they termed cultural Bolshevism or cultural degeneracy. This was a catch-all category that included modern art, jazz music, certain forms of literature and film, and various cultural practices that the Nazis viewed as corrupting influences on German society. The term degenerate was central to Nazi ideology, applied to art, music, people and practices that supposedly weakened the German racial stock or undermined traditional values. By labeling Halloween degenerate, the Nazis were placing it in the same category as the avant-garde art they removed from museums and the jazz music they banned from radio. The irony is that Halloween was barely celebrated in Germany in 1933 anyway. It was not a traditional German holiday, and American-style Halloween celebrations had not yet spread to Europe in any significant way. The Nazi denunciation of Halloween was largely symbolic, part of a broader effort to define German culture in opposition to foreign influences and to assert control over all aspects of social life. Whether Germans actually celebrated Halloween or not was almost beside the point. The condemnation served to draw boundaries, to define what was acceptably German and what was foreign contamination. But while the Nazi regime publicly rejected Halloween and similar traditions as degenerate, Heinrich Himmler was privately obsessed with pre-Christian Germanic paganism, mysticism, and occult practices. Himmler was not typical, even among Nazi leaders, in the intensity of his esoteric interests. While Hitler himself showed little interest in the occult, and many other Nazi leaders were focused primarily on power and material concerns, Himmler genuinely believed in mystical ideas about Aryan racial superiority, having ancient spiritual roots. He saw the SS not just as an elite military and police organization, but as a racial and spiritual order, inheritors of ancient Germanic warrior traditions. Himmler's personal castle at Wewelsburg in Westphalia became the center of his attempts to create SS mystical traditions. He acquired the castle in 1934 and spent enormous sums, including forced labor from concentration camp prisoners, to renovate and expand it according to his vision. Wewelsburg was intended to be the spiritual center of the SS, a place where the order's elite would gather for ceremonies and rituals that Himmler was essentially inventing, drawing on his interpretations of Germanic paganism mixed with various occult and mystical traditions. The architecture and design of Wewelsburg reflected Himmler's obsessions. The North Tower featured a circular room called the Obergruppenführersaal, or the Hall of the Supreme SS Leaders, with 12 pedestals arranged in a circle, meant to evoke King Arthur's Round Table, or the 12 Knights of Germanic legend. Directly below this room was the Valhalla, a circular chamber with a stone depression in the center, that Himmler called the realm of the dead. The symbolism throughout the castle emphasized death, warrior traditions, and mystical concepts drawn from Himmler's eclectic understanding of Germanic paganism. It was in this context that Himmler conducted ceremonies that, while not officially called Halloween celebrations, shared remarkable similarities with exactly the kind of death-focused, occult-tinged practices that the Nazi regime publicly condemned as degenerate. Himmler's ceremonies at Wewelsburg often took place during significant dates in the Germanic pagan calendar, including times corresponding roughly to Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival that influenced Halloween. These ceremonies involved SS officers gathering by candlelight in the castle's ceremonial spaces, surrounded by symbolism of death and the supernatural. The use of human skulls in these ceremonies represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Himmler's practices. They, SS, particularly under Himmler's direction, collected human remains for various pseudo-scientific and occult purposes. Himmler believed in the possibility of proving Aryan racial superiority through study of skeletal remains and measurements. He authorized the creation of collections of skulls and skeletons, some of which came from concentration camp victims, specifically murdered for this purpose. The Ahnenerbe, an SS research organization that Himmler founded to study Germanic prehistory and prove Nazi racial theories, was involved in these horrific activities. At Wewelsburg, skulls were incorporated into the decoration and ceremonial practices. Some accounts suggest that skulls were displayed in certain rooms, used as part of the Gothic, death-focused aesthetic that Himmler cultivated. Whether these were actual human skulls or replicas is unclear in some cases, but given Himmler's known practices and the SS's access to human remains from concentration camps and other sources, the possibility that real human skulls were used is genuinely disturbing. The ceremonies conducted in spaces decorated with such remains would have resembled nothing so much as a dark parody of Halloween, with SS officers in their black uniforms gathering in a medieval castle surrounded by symbols of death. The hypocrisy of this situation is remarkable. The Nazi regime condemned Halloween as degenerate foreign superstition. Yet Himmler, one of the regime's most powerful leaders, was conducting secret ceremonies in a castle decorated with skulls, celebrating pagan festivals related to death and the supernatural, yet conducted with skulls related to death and the supernatural, engaging in exactly the kind of occult practices that would have been denounced as primitive and degenerate if practiced by anyone outside the SS elite. This contradiction reveals something important about how totalitarian ideologies work. The rules and condemnations apply to the masses, but the elite often exempt themselves, pursuing interests and practices that would be forbidden to ordinary people. Himmler's occult interests were not entirely secret within the Nazi leadership, but they were also not widely publicized. Hitler himself reportedly found Himmler's mystical obsessions tiresome and silly, though he tolerated them as long as Himmler remained effective in his role running the SS and implementing Nazi racial policies. Other Nazi leaders made jokes about Himmler's fascination with paganism and mysticism. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, later wrote about how Himmler would bore dinner guests with lengthy monologues about Germanic prehistory and mystical racial theories. But Himmler's power was such that no one openly challenged his right to pursue these interests. The ceremonies at Wewelsburg were attended by high-ranking SS officers, men who were simultaneously implementing the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities while participating in mystical rituals in a medieval castle. This combination of modern industrial genocide with pseudo-medieval occult practices is one of the most bizarre and disturbing aspects of the Nazi regime. These were not ignorant primitives engaging in superstition. They were educated men with access to modern technology and organizational methods, yet they gathered in a castle to conduct rituals involving death symbolism and mystical beliefs about racial destiny. The specific nature of the ceremonies conducted at Wewelsburg remains somewhat unclear because much of the documentation was destroyed at the end of the war, and surviving participants had reasons to downplay or conceal what had taken place. Some accounts describe ceremonies involving oaths, ritual speaking, candlelight processions through the castle, and meditation or contemplation in the circular chambers. The ceremonies were meant to create a sense of mystical brotherhood among SS leaders, to connect them to what Himmler imagined were ancient Germanic warrior traditions, and to ritualize their commitment to the SS and its racial mission. The timing of some ceremonies to correspond with dates significant in pagan calendars meant that some would have occurred around the end of October and beginning of November, the period associated with Samhain and later Halloween. While Himmler would not have called these Halloween celebrations, the timing and the themes of death, spirits, and the supernatural created parallels that are impossible to ignore. The man helping to lead a regime that condemned Halloween as degenerate was conducting his own ceremonies, featuring exactly the elements that made Halloween objectionable to Nazi cultural authorities: foreign pagan influences, death symbolism, and occult practices. The use of Wewelsburg Castle itself added to the Halloween-like atmosphere. Medieval castles, with their associations with ghosts, dungeons, and dark history, are central to Halloween imagery. Himmler chose to conduct his ceremonies in exactly this kind of setting, embracing the Gothic and the macabre in ways that would have been perfectly at home in Halloween celebrations. The castle's dungeons were actually used to imprison and torture people, adding a layer of real horror beneath the theatrical occultism of Himmler's ceremonies. The contradiction between Nazi public ideology and Himmler's private practices reflects a broader pattern of Nazi hypocrisy. The regime that claimed to represent modern scientific rationalism and German cultural superiority was led by men who engaged in mysticism, superstition, and invented traditions. The ideology that condemned others for degeneracy was itself deeply irrational and based on pseudoscientific racial theories that had no basis in actual science. The regime that claimed to be purifying German culture was led by men who engaged in exactly the kind of occult practices that they condemned when found among those they considered racially inferior. After the war, as the full extent of Nazi crimes became known, Himmler's occult practices at Wewelsburg became part of the broader understanding of how deeply twisted the Nazi leadership had been. The image of SS officers gathering in a castle surrounded by human skulls to conduct mystical ceremonies became a symbol of the regime's fundamental perversity. These were men who had used the machinery of a modern industrial state to commit genocide while simultaneously playing at being pagan priests in a medieval castle. The disconnect between their modern methods of murder and their pseudo-medieval mystical theater reveals the incoherence at the heart of Nazi ideology. Wewelsburg Castle survived the war, though Himmler ordered it partially destroyed as Allied forces approached. Today it houses a museum and memorial, documenting the history of the SS and its crimes. The ceremonial rooms where Himmler conducted his rituals can be visited, though the human remains are long gone. The castle stands as a reminder of the bizarre combination of modern evil and pseudo-mystical theater that characterized some aspects of the Nazi regime. The historical irony of Hitler banning Halloween as degenerate while Himmler conducted skull-decorated ceremonies in an SS castle captures something essential about totalitarian hypocrisy. The rules and condemnations apply to the masses while the elite pursue their own obsessions, exempt from the restrictions they impose on others. The regime that claimed to be purifying German culture and eliminating degenerate foreign influences was itself deeply corrupt and incoherent, led by men whose private practices contradicted their public ideology. The story also reveals how the Nazi emphasis on creating an invented tradition of Germanic paganism and mysticism was fundamentally fraudulent. Himmler was not recovering authentic ancient practices, but rather creating new rituals based on his own eclectic and often confused understanding of history, mythology, and the occult. The ceremonies at Wewelsburg were not Germanic traditions being preserved, but rather one man's fantasies being enacted by SS officers who went along with their leader's obsessions because he held power over their careers and lives. The human cost of Himmler's occult interests should not be forgotten. The collection of skulls and the pseudo-scientific research conducted to support Nazi racial theories required victims. People were murdered specifically to provide specimens for Himmler's collections and research projects. The same organization that conducted ceremonies in a castle was simultaneously operating the concentration camp system and implementing the final solution. The skulls used in Himmler's ceremonies represented actual human beings who had been murdered by the regime he helped lead. The contradiction between condemning Halloween and conducting even more macabre ceremonies at Wewelsburg ultimately demonstrates that Nazi cultural policies were never about consistent principles but rather about power and control. Halloween was condemned, not because there was anything inherently wrong with it, but because it represented foreign influence, and because condemning it allowed the regime to assert authority over German cultural life. Meanwhile, Himmler's practices at Wewelsburg were tolerated despite being far more genuinely disturbing because he was part of the ruling elite and his power protected him from the rules applied to everyone else. This kind of hypocrisy is characteristic of authoritarian systems where ideology serves as a tool of control rather than a genuine set of principles consistently applied.